Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus, providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Anne Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Craig, Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Robert Craig is away, but Roundup regulars John Katzka and Anne Hamilton are here ably holding down the fort as we look at frost warning. After delivering dueling speeches at the UN this week, President Obama and Vladimir Putin met for some additional face-to-face diplomatic jousting. What do the chilly atmospherics tell us about Putin's view of the U.S.-Russian relationship? La Paz in Colombia. A peace agreement between the government of Colombia and FARC guerrillas could mark the end of the world's longest-running war. What drove the conflict, and how is the framework for a deal finally reached? Belaboring the point. In a party conference speech, newly elected Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn mapped out a strategy he summarized as a fight back. What does he want to do with Labour, and how receptive are the UK voters likely to be? And Salman's splendid little war. The death of over 130 wedding guests in an airstrike in Yemen this week underscored a growing humanitarian crisis as Saudi King Salman tries to put down an Iranian-backed insurgency in the country next door. What's behind Saudi Arabia's uncharacteristically muscular response to the conflict, and what are the repercussions in the region and beyond? Well, welcome back, two of you. John, we'll start with you and Mr. Putin's speech. First of all, what did he say at the UN?
Well, it's very interesting to contrast the two speeches. Because Obama's and Putin's, because both of them talked to the ideals of the UN. They talked about the importance of conciliation and working together, but they had very different views on what they meant. Obama was talking about the importance of individuals, and if you look at the Crimea and the Ukraine story, it was the individuals that we were promoting and supporting in that. Whereas Putin, when he looks at this, is talking about the importance of the state, because the United Nations is an organization of states, not individuals. And so he's saying, going back to the principles of the UN, this is what you're supposed to support. So they weren't exactly talking to each other. But this is a very evolving story. And it's going to, by the time this gets on the air, there will be some developments which may be outside of our purview right now. But I'll turn it over to Anne.
So what did you hear, Anne?
What did I hear? Well, I heard definitely President Putin was definitely asserting himself on the world stage, came in pretty much ignoring what had gone on, the condemnation of the annexation of Crimea, blasting the Obama administration in the West for interventions in 2003 in Iraq and the 2011 intervention in Libya as creating as causing actually all of the turmoil that there is in the world today. A very strong support for the Syrian president, saying it's anybody who's responsible would have to support him in his fight against terror. It was a much shorter speech than Obama's speech was. I think that Obama's was about 45 minutes and Putin's was about 20 minutes. They made some remark on Russian TV about how Obama had taken all of Putin's time. You know, this is played very, very, very well on Russian television. This great assertion of Putin on the world stage, his rightful place on the world stage. sort of telling the world what it was all about, what's going on, really, in their terms. So, I mean, it was a confident performance, not that deftly delivered, I must say. He hurried through his speech, probably because he was worried about the time. But a very different interpretation of international law, certainly.
Well, and to what extent is the situation in Syria and Russia's role therein really kind of the ticket back into the world stage, do you think? I mean, it certainly seemed to be the way it was being played.
Well, yes. Well, first of all, Russia has a long-term, go back to the mid-50s, relationship with Syria. When it was part of the Cold War, we backed one country, they backed another one that was opposing that particular country. But I'm reminded of an interview that Stephen Kinzer gave that suggests that when you negotiate, you have to talk to everybody. And I find that I think Kerry is doing a much better job than Obama right now, because Kerry is willing to talk to everyone. And we're not going to resolve the situation in Syria without Assad being part of the discussion. It doesn't mean that we have to endorse what he does or who he is. It means that he is a party to this process. And if we think that all we have to do is look at what happened in Iraq when we denied the Sunnis a participation in the peace, well, chaos resulted.
Well, and you touched on this. There seemed to be a motif running through the speech that obviously, tyranny is better than anarchy, and we were better off when we had these strong men in place.
Right. I think that from President Putin's position is really very straightforward, and it's very simple to understand. There are a lot of Russians, particularly from Chechnya, who have gone and are participating in ISIS. And it's a direct threat to the Russian state, and he feels that it's just much better to deal with the terrorists on the territory of the Middle East than to have them go back home and commit terrorist attacks there. It's just he presents it in very simple terms. This is a fight against terrorism. It's very much during the Cold War, we was certainly, as long as you were against the Soviet Union, it was fine. We were fine dealing with a lot of dictators then who were committing terrible atrocities. So it was a simplified version of the world, but it comes across in a very compelling way, I think, to
well,
the
we
audience.
also, I mean, if you look at Bahrain, where we are backing a Sunni royalty at the expense of a very large Shia majority, that's almost a flip of the. But we pick our bad guys carefully, and so that we have a good chance or a decent chance of beating them.
So after the speeches, there was this face-to-face encounter. What did you see there in just the optics of that meeting?
Well, the handshake was very brief. The New York Times photo was quite interesting because it showed, President Obama sticking his hand out and Putin sort of looking at it like, ugh, I don't really want to take that. And that's what a lot of people see. But actually, if you watch the clip, it wasn't that bad. I mean, a lot of people have made a lot of the theatrics, and I think that. I think it's better to focus on the substance of what was going on, actually.
One of the things we need to watch, though, with the Russians there and becoming active in air targeting, the chance of a confrontation is much greater. And there's no, it almost reminds me of Yugoslavia during World War II, where the Chetniks and the communists fought against each other more than they fought against the Nazis. There's a little bit of that going on in Syria right now, and the Russians may be fighting against ISIS, but at the same time they're fighting against those who are fighting against Assad.
Well, clearly we'll be dealing with Mr. Putin and Russia in this conflict going forward, but now we'll move to a different part of the world. And what happened in Havana?
Well, so much has been happening in Havana lately with the Pope's visit and all. It turns out the Pope was instrumental in this peace treaty that it hasn't been concluded yet, but there was a handshake between the president of Colombia and the leader of the FARC, which is a Marxist, I think it stands for Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. They've been engaged in a civil war with the government for 50 years, more than 50 years. Over 220,000 casualties and millions of displaced people during this time period. And after a 3-year negotiation in Havana, they have finally reached what looks like the major elements of a deal. And it's an extraordinary, interesting deal because it had gotten hung up on the deal. The negotiations almost ended over a dispute over transitional justice. That is, how the victims are going to be compensated or receive reparations, and also how the perpetrators of all the horrors of the war will be tried or have to, pay for their crimes. So they came up with a very interesting combination of prosecution as well as a truth commission. Apparently they spent time talking to people from the Good Friday Accord in Northern Ireland. They looked at the South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a number of instances in Latin America where they've had combinations of amnesties and truth and reconciliation and prosecution, and come up with this hybrid deal whereby those who are willing to confess to what they've done to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission will get 5 to 8 years of service of some sort. It's sort of like house arrest with public service, going and perhaps cleaning up landmines or making some kind of reparations to the victims. And then the punishment goes up. If you don't confess, you may end up getting 20 years actually in jail. And the extraordinary thing about this is that it will apply not only to the guerrilla, the FARC members, but also to the state, the military, the government's military, and also to paramilitary figures, if it all goes through as planned.
Yeah, right now it's the end of the year before the actual cessation of hostilities, and then it's June of next year when the Congress meets to approve the deal. So there is a bit of time for things to create problems.
Yes.
But this could have a large economic impact on Colombia, isn't it, as well? I think one group estimated that the war saps something in the neighborhood of 18% of the GDP from the Colombian economy.
Yes, and the Colombian economy has been doing well lately, so then this could be a signal to attract more foreign investment. And I mean, because this has been a terrible war, and it still has the potential to continue. There in remote areas of the country where they could still, continue the fight if this falls through.
Well, and focusing on the potential for fallout or fall through is the former president is one of the opponents of this particular deal. So,
right, and his position is basically the deal lets the perpetrators off the hook. Right, he would like to fall more on if there's a balance between justice and peace, he's more in the justice camp.
That's right, and the Colombian people have to approve this deal as well, which it'll be very interesting to see what kind of public relations campaign is carried out to try and get them to support it. Obviously, after 50 years of fighting, there are a lot of people who just want to see it end.
Yeah. And the FARC isn't the only player in this game, too. There's another smaller ELN group that apparently has very close ties to Havana, but
is not party to this.
But is not party to this, but is on the fringes of it because it is apparently having some communication with FARC about strategies.
Well, as always, another one to keep tuned.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be back with more, but first we're going to take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking as usual with John Katzka and Anne Hamilton. And I'll throw this open to whoever would like to jump in. In the UK, the Labour Party recently elected a new leader who was a dark horse, to say the least, but ended up having a rather resounding victory. Jeremy Corbyn. Can we learn a little bit about him?
Well, he comes from the far left wing of the party. He's not particularly a public figure and wasn't even seeking that up till recently. But he wants to take the party back to its roots. He wants to allow more internal debate. He wants to make it more of a class movement. He wants to check businesses' interest in globalization, which means he wants to nationalize, especially certainly the utilities, but other businesses as well. Definitely a throwback.
And maybe we could talk a little bit about what he's railing against in terms of New Labour and Tony Blair's era.
Well, Tony Blair was, he definitely took the party to the center. He did not follow the lead of the unions. A lot of union people were against him. He's particularly unpopular for getting for the support for the Iraq War in 2003, for which a lot of people cannot forgive him.
There was an epithet of he was George Bush's poodle at one point.
Yes, he was definitely seen as a poodle, and the party has been struggling ever since to sort of create its identity, a separate identity, without going back to the 60s and all. But it appears to have given up on that, and it's back to the 60s. In choosing this leader, apparently the electorate, there was a new rule that came in that allowed people to register to vote in the selection of the party leader. You could just register as a supporter for less than $5. And so the number of people voting for party leader was something like 3 times more than in the May elections.
Probably a bunch of conservatives voting for him.
There were some people who were doing that as spoilers, yeah. But so there's this new surge of support, apparently a lot of youth, but it's very unclear. He has very little support amongst the rank and file of the party, which is pretty interesting. And
which is now sort of Blairite, right,
yes,
at this point?
Yes, and when he announced his cabinet, when he selected his cabinet, he put in a group of middle-aged white men, which got him a lot of flack. So, so he's made some mistakes already.
Well, but John, what does this say? I mean, particularly, it's fascinating. You say the pool of people who could cast a vote for him was much larger and presumably much broader based, and this is the result. So what does that say about the electorate at large, that when you widen the pool, this is the result you get? I mean,
I'm not sure it says anything about it, because it was self-selecting. It's not the election itself. The backdrop to this is that the Conservatives are comfortably in power. And one of the reasons that Labor might be doing this is to, instead of looking like an almost the same run,
Tory light,
right? Tory light. They are taking on a very different position. The Liberal Democrats, which were really badly bounced in the last election, are kind of hopeful that if Labor moves further to the left, that they can seek out that middle ground and rebuild their fortunes.
But, we've seen throughout Europe sort of this movement of sort of Eurosceptic, and sometimes it's expressed on the right, sometimes it's expressed on the left. Does this reflect that in any way, or is it just sort of an anomalous thing that Mr. Corbyn was elected?
I don't see it in Labor's vote. I see it more in the conservative group, where there are backbenchers who are less supportive of Europe. And it's also, taking a page out of our history, where the major parties have always taken some of the major planks of third parties and took them on as their own. This could also be something that conservatives will be doing as well.
So, Anne, you mentioned that much of the sort of establishment labor comes from that Tony Blair era and is not thrilled to see essentially a purge in the making. Do you think Mr. Corbyn can successfully unite the party and be a viable leader?
I doubt it. I mean, all the analyses say they're just going to wait until it looks as if, they've got to find somebody else. And one of the problems in this election was that the three people who had stated they were running and run campaigns to be head of the Labour Party, by all accounts, each one was very dull. Not inspiring in the least. I was talking to British friends. Each one said that was the problem. I mean, there was just nothing inspiring there. So you get this ideologue coming along who's sort of pushed to, and they think, well, at least this will be a different voice. But I think that they'll wait out until they can find a viable alternative, and then maybe a year or two from now, he will lose the party leadership.
So you think there's no appetite certainly within the party or even in the wider electorate for this sort of more class-conscious Labour Party?
Well, I think it definitely fills a need in the sense that it widens the discussion, it broadens the discussion to issues that are important to a lot of people. And that's important, but I don't think that Jeremy Corbyn himself is going to be the person who, becomes the next prime minister on an income inequality platform.
Well, let's move on to our final story about the conflict in Yemen and sort of the implications of that. So let's first of all just recap the conflict. Who's fighting who and what are they fighting about?
Got a scorecard?
There's a group called the Houthis who took control of the capital last March. Their support is largely in the north of the country, and the Saudis have intervened in order to fight against the Houthis. They're conducting airstrikes against them. I mean, it's a very complicated. There are local politics, there are historical politics, the history of the politics, because the countries were divided until 1990. There's a power differential in terms of who gets what in the resources of the country, and there's the whole Sunni-Shia divide that's layered on it with Iran supporting the Houthis, although they say they're not. And the Saudis actually conducting airstrikes as part of the Gulf Cooperation Council together, which is, your lead about the wedding party that was attacked recently. And there have been many, many civilian casualties. It's a terrible situation that's going on there.
So, we typically do not think of the Saudis as the sharp end of the spear in military activity in the region. What's changed?
Well, King Salman changed. And one of the criticisms of him has been that he doesn't seem to care much about risk. He's willing to get out there and become very active. But the Saudi House right now has got a number of issues they're dealing with. The opening the tap on oil and driving down the price of oil, which was probably aimed mostly at Iran, and Russia to a degree, is backfiring now because what they're doing is running a budget deficit of significant.
I think the national budget was predicated on the assumption of $90 a barrel oil, and we're trading currently below 50.
Right. So he's got that. He's got then we have the two incidents at the Hajj, where total probably 1,000 people died in terms of in Mecca, and add to this, he also has been doing house cleaning amongst in the royal family in terms of who's in positions of power. So there's probably a little resistance out there because what's happening in Yemen is not all that wonderful. I mean, at one point I should make to the where things are in Yemen, the Houthis were not being supported by Iran at the beginning. It was because of Saudi actions against the Houthis that the Iran, I guess, well, I don't know who approached whom, but that's where the connection was established. But it made it part of the Sunni-Shia split.
Well, we've got a situation now for the Gulf monarchies where there was the Arab Spring, which probably did not give them a great deal of comfort. There's the turmoil now as a result in Libya and Iraq and Syria, the resulting rise of Iran, and I think the prospect of U.S. disengaging from the region. So,
not to mention the Iran nuclear deal, which they're opposed to. They're in a very uncomfortable position.
And so this might just be a reflection of that discomfort, feeling like, well, we've got nothing to lose, right? It's now or never.
Well, we're also in an uncomfortable position, too, because the U.S. is targeting al-Qaeda elements within Yemen who are fighting against the Houthis.
Right.
So there we go.
Very complicated.
Well, as always, it's very complicated. So, and we'll have to leave it at that. But we'll be back next time. Thank you to our panel, and thank you to you for watching. We'll see you next time.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,